Good morning, all. Jessica Matthews. I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today for this dialogue, and I want to especially welcome our Chinese colleagues who have made a very long trip, some of them with hours diverted in unpleasant airports to be here, and we're very grateful to you. Our goal for this meeting is to explore best policies and practices in coal development and management in both the United States and China, and to identify how best to strike a balance between exploiting coal's energy value and protecting the climate. Protecting energy and climate futures are, of course, a global issue, but coal is primarily now a U.S. and China issue. And so it's appropriate that we're discussing it in this context. Together, our two countries represent 60% of global coal consumption, but it won't be long before others particularly catch up. India, of course, very much on all of our minds. And but if the United States and China can chart together a cleaner path for developing and managing coal, it will set a direction for the rest of the world, and that doubles the importance of this enterprise. Currently, however, China and the U.S. are going in almost exactly opposite directions. China has more than tripled coal production since 1990 to 3.7 billion tons and is now the world's biggest coal importer. The United States has reduced coal production over this same period to less than 900 million tons and is now a net coal exporter. Coal represented 70% of China's direct energy use in 2011 and less than 22% in the United States and falling. Both countries, of course, have a major problem with coal emissions, and coal is a primary, with carbon emissions, and coal is a primary source. So we do need to address this problem together, although coming from very divergent contexts right now. And that's why we are here today to share respective experiences in coal management and to explore how we can work more closely and more effectively together. This is, I should emphasize, an urgent need. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, warned this year that business as usual trajectories on carbon emissions lead to a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures in this century. That means with current life expectancies in the lives of your children. The World Bank recently released a report documenting the impact of a 4-degree increase, and it is catastrophic. If the world is to avoid this fate, then it is on the backs of the United States and China's leadership that it will do so. Just a word on the context of this meeting. It is the second of two coal value chain dialogues between the U.S. and China teams that we have convened. The first took place in Beijing in last October. We are very pleased to be working to have initiated this dialogue in collaboration with the Tsinghua BP Clean Energy Research and Education Center under the leadership of Dr. Linwei Ma in Beijing and under the co-leadership of Kevin Tu on our team here in Washington at Carnegie. The product will be a report recommending policies to clean up, cap, and eventually reduce coal-related carbon emissions in both countries. We will also make recommendations for reducing air and water pollution and for improving the health and welfare of communities up and down the coal value chain. Before I close and turn the microphone over to Kevin Tu, I do want to thank the Energy Foundation and the Henry Luce Foundation, whose generous support made this exchange possible. Finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We are delighted to have you here. Welcome. With all that said, Kevin, let me turn the microphone over to you and to the first panel.
Thank you, Jessica, for your welcome address. When I was in China, people often ask me why I work for the energy sector. So the answer is pretty simple, because both my father and my mother work for Sinopec, the Chinese national oil company. And people also keep asking me why you are so interested in coal. The reason actually is not very complicated. My home back in China is very close to a petroleum refineries, but in about 2 kilometers distance, there is a coal-fired power plant. When I was young, my mother often complained about there are so many dust in the room, so she needed to constantly clean the room. So that's my first personal impression of the Chinese coal. After I went to Canada for my graduate study on resource management, I started to understand the profound energy and environmental implication of China's heavy reliance on coal, which is 70% for now. And after I attended so many international climate negotiations, I also became very concerned about the rising carbon emissions from the Chinese coal. In 2010, coal-fired carbon emissions in China were 17% higher than the national carbon dioxide emissions in the United States, which is the second largest carbon emitter in the world. So that's why I'm very glad I can have this opportunity to work with so many of the leading experts in China, United States, and Europe. So I'd like to introduce the first panel, how to clean the Chinese coal value chain. Dr. Marlin Wei is the Deputy Director at the Tsinghua BP Clean Energy Research and Education Center. He is also the co-organizer of this event with me. And on October 24th, 2012, we organized the first coal value chain exchange in Beijing, which has been well received by the Chinese energy and climate communities. The second guest is also from China, Dr. Liu Qiang, who is the Director of the Strategy and Planning Department at the National Center for Climate Change. He previously worked for the Energy Research Institute under the National Development and Reform Commission. We have worked with each other for many years. And the last commentators is Dr. Yang Fuqiang. If I organize this event in China, Dr. Yang is one of the experts that don't need any introduction. And I would also give any of you in this room a tips. Whenever you organize an event with the ENGO community in China, Dr. Yang should never be invited to speak as the first speaker. The reason is pretty simple. After his talk, everyone will say, I agree with him. So that's why this time when I invited Dr. Yang to serve as speaker, he will only serve as the speaker for the last panel. Now I'd like to talk about how to manage Chinese coal. My talk will be divided into 3 segments. The first one is those most important drivers when the Chinese decision makers to think about national energy and environmental policy. The first one is economic development. Second one, energy security. The third one is environmental protection. Then I will briefly give some more background information on Chinese coal value chain, followed with some of those recommendations that will be in our final report. If we compare the major economic and energy indicators between the United States and China. From 1980, that's basically shortly after Deng Xiaoping opened the Chinese economy to the outside world, to 2011, we can certainly see China has quickly developed from a developing country to a hybrid economy. The reason is pretty simple. If we look at the size of Chinese economy, it's approaching the United States. But if we look at per capita GDP, per capita energy consumption, it's lag far behind. So that's why China needs to keep develop its economy. Another reason is currently only half of Chinese population live in the city. So the population expansion in the urban center will become a very important driver to underline Chinese energy consumption growth. If we look at another issue, the energy security, it's become increasingly serious in China. In 2011, 82% of Chinese crude oil imports will pass Strait of Malacca. And if we look at how many percentage of crude oil are sourced from Middle East, that's more than 50%. And about 56.5% of Chinese crude are imported. So the country certainly needs to do more in order to secure its energy supply. There are two complicated development in this regard. If we look at what's going on in the United States, on the one hand, because of the unconventional oil and gas development in this country, so the dependence rate on foreign oil in the United States are quickly decreased from 60% in 2005. That's when CNOOC's unsuccessful bid of Unoco happened, to 45% now. In 2012, CNOOC was able to successfully buy Nexen in Canada. That might have some relationship with this type of development in the United States. On the other hand, if we look at the U.S. rebalancing in Asia, this certainly makes the Chinese decision makers very nervous. In the future, if the mistrust between U.S. and China can be reduced, China may be able to rely more on international market instead of the domestic resource for energy consumption. The third issue is environmental constraints. In this room, we all understand carbon emissions is a very important environmental concern. However, back in China, the environmental concern for air pollution and for water contamination actually have much higher policy priority than climate change. That's the fact we need to take into consideration. Now I'd like to quickly go through the Chinese coal value chain from coal resource. China actually is the second largest coal reserves, just behind the United States. However, the distribution of the Chinese coal resources are far away from the consumption center. That's why most of the Chinese coal needs to be shipped long distance from production center in Shanxi, Shanxi, Inner Mongolia to coastal ports such as Qinhuangdao, then go through the marine transportation to consumption center in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and other parts of China. So shipping coal from central China to the coastal province might be more energy intensive and also more expensive than importing coal from Indonesia, Australia. China currently consume and produce about half of global coal. In early 2000s, the safety record was terrible, but now the government has made a significant improvement. Half of Chinese coal are produced by key state-owned enterprise. 1/3 of them are from the private industry. And currently, China has both the best coal mine and also the worst coal mine in the world. Transportation bottleneck is one of the most important policy concerns in China. After March, I believe the Ministry of Railway may be merged with the Ministry of Transportation. However, even if deregulation happens in this sector, the Chinese decision maker need to pay attention to one fact. This is a sector the government actually can manipulate a little bit in order to keep the price, a coal price in coastal province relatively high in order to deprive consumption in those regions. And coal is the most important energy in China. The reason is very simple, because China basically have not so much other fossil fuel in terms of oil or gas. China only have only 2% of China's fossil fuel reserves are oil, and it's only account for less than 1% of the world total. The picture for natural gas is the same, so that's why the country have to continuously rely on coal in the fossil fuel in the future. If we look at the size of China's energy consumption growth and the size of global coal trade and the global crude market and the global gas market, China cannot entirely rely on international energy trade to meet its own domestic energy consumption. So that's another reason coal needs to be better managed in this country. After Fukushima Daiichi, nuclear ambition in China has been scaled back. And shale gas and coal-bed methane are relatively difficult to develop. And large hydro actually can cause many environmental concerns. And also there's a water dispute with those neighboring economies. And China has a trade dispute in the wind and solar sector with the US and now with the EU. And overcapacity and the transmission sector are all policy concerns the government needs to deal with. So when we look at Chinese coal imports, in 2012, 41% of Chinese coal are from Indonesia. If we look at the United States, only 3% is from US. And according to China customers, it's less than 10 million tons per year. So that's not huge. However, if we look at the intention of the industry in this country, because they understand pretty well the future of coal in this country won't be beautiful. So there are currently 6 coal export terminals proposed in the West Coastal region in the United States. But because of the strong environmental opposition in this country, none of them can get a construction permit so far. Now I'd like to talk about several policy recommendations that are likely to appear in the final report. The first one is about how to govern the Chinese energy sector, because recently there is a rumor about the promotion of the National Energy Administration to a ministry level agency, but still under the supervision of the National Development and Reform Commission. I was once a big fan of a super energy ministry in China, but after a while, I realized this actually shouldn't be the emphasis of energy reform in China, because what's more important is how the energy sector can be governed by the government. If the market can function, the government certainly needs to reduce its intervention to the market and focus more on environmental externalities, and also create to introduce competition by allowing market entrance of private company and international cooperation in the energy sector. The second issue is almost an open secret in the Chinese energy and environmental expert community. Everyone understands the statistical distortion in China's energy sector sometimes can be quite confusing. For example, if we look at China's coal imports from Indonesia, if we use data from the Chinese source, it's 61% lower than the data provided by the Indonesia source. This needs to be fixed as soon as possible. And some additional policy recommendations is, we all know China is famous for its 5-year development plan, but what the country needs to do next is to have a medium to long-term national energy and climate strategy that aims to accelerate the peaking of both national coal consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the carbon trade panels in China, they will be piloted in 5 Chinese cities and 2 provinces. This is very important for Chinese governments, especially those local governors, to understand the importance of MRV in the energy sector. But meanwhile, I personally prefer a carbon tax to be imposed in China in order to retard greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And finally, I would say China needs to actively encourage energy imports in order to suppress coal mining, long-distance transport of domestic coal, and coal end use across the country. When I talk about energy imports, I mean both natural gas and also coal. However, for that to happen, the mistrust between China and the United States needs to be further suppressed in order for the country to become more confident to rely on international energy trade instead of mining all the domestic coals. So this is the schedule, how the final report will be released. Dr. Manning Wei and I will co-organize the final report release event in Washington, D.C. and Beijing in late May to early June. And also, on June 14th, I will speak at the Coal-Trans West Coast to share my research finding with the coal industry in the United States. And I will also speak about this report in our EU Center and also in the Global Energy System Conference in UK. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it's my honor here to present a short speech to all of you, and thanks for Carnegie Endowment for organizing the meeting. So it make my task here is very simple. I need to give a talk. And my talk is about the sustainable development of coal value chain in China and the US, but with a focus on China. So first, I will present you some facts about the energy use of coal in China and also a comparison with US. And then I will propose 3 strategic issues I think is very important for sustainable development of coal value chain in China and also some policy implications for Sino-US cooperation. And the first slide just reminds us the role of coal in these 2 countries. And these 2 figures are the primary energy consumption by source in these 2 countries, China in the left and US in the right. And noticing the green line is consumption of coal in these 2 countries. So it just reminds us that coal is a dominatory energy source in China, over nearly 70%. And the consumption is still rapidly increasing. And for US, the 3rd largest energy sources, but the consumption is rapidly decreasing in recent years. And so how coal is used in China? It could be illustrated by mapping the energy flows along the coal value chain. In these 2 diagrams, in the top is a diagram for 2005, and in the bottom is a diagram for 2010. And in each diagram, the coal value chain is divided into stages from left to right by raw coal supply, and then coal product supply together with coal washing, and then coal conversion, and then end use, and then final sectors. And you can see that the dark flows is raw coal, and the deep gray is washed coal, and the light gray is coke, and the light blue is electricity, the red is heat. So from these 2 diagrams, it's very easy to capture main characteristics of the coal value chain in China. In raw coal supply, we are mainly depend on domestic underground mining, and China have very diversified energy end use of coal. For example, half used for power generation, 20% used for coking, and rest 30% direct fuel use of coal by boilers for industry and residential heating. And you can see that here, yeah, sorry. You can see here that for final sectors, because this map do not show energy losses, so the responsibility for consumption is very obviously that industry is the biggest, dominated, and especially for heavy industry such as steel and cement, largest user of coal, energy from coal. And from these 2 diagrams, the ongoing trend is that from 2005 to 2010, China has increased surface mining because the coal mining now is moving to the west where the coal resource is better. And we have more coal import, as mentioned by Kevin. And the portion of coal washing is increasing very rapidly. and also a little increase for the portion that used coal for power generation. And it's just two diagrams that show you that a little increase of the coal use for power generation in these 5 years. And for the end-use sector, the portion of end-use sector that's kept, still no big change. And also the efficiency of the coal use in China. You can see that the main energy losses actually first come from coal power generation, and the next is boilers, burning coal as fuel in end use, such as residential and industry. And as measured by these diagrams, the total efficiency of coal use increasing in recent years from 52.5% in 2005 to 53.1% in 2010. And the main contributor is that the improving efficiency of power generation in China. As shown here, that in 2005, the power generation efficiency is about 33%, and in 2010, it has improved close to 37% very rapidly. Also, there's a little increase in boiler efficiency, and which cannot show be here that in recent years we have achieved very good improvements of also the energy intensity of our industry products. And this one may be interesting. We compare that the coal use in China and US together. In the left, in the bottom, is that coal value chain, coal energy flows for the coal value chain in the United States, and in the right, in the bottom, is China's simple map. So, besides the difference of the scale, because China consumes so much coal, the major difference is that United States has more underground mining, which I think the cost is much lower, and is a net exporter of coal. For coal conversion, United States mainly used coal for power generation, over 90%, while China has a more diversified structure of coal conversion, including coke and direct fuel use. And for energy end use, United States has more diversified usage, including 1/3 for industry, 1/3 for residential, and 1/3 for commercial. But for China, the dominant sector is still industry. So next, I will propose 3 strategic issues. First is that how to control the energy demand from coal. And the next is how to avoid overcapacity problem. And the third is how to use coal more efficiently and efficiently and cleaner. So first, how to control energy demand from coal. Why it is important? Because, as mentioned by Kevin, the indigenous coal production capacity is restricted by many factors in China, including ecology, transportation, and also emission reduction. And we know that coal contains more potential pollutants and carbon per unit energy. But the problem is that it's not that because we like coal, but we have no other choices once we have a very huge new energy demand generated. The underlying mechanism that actually the demand of coal is decided by the demand for end-use energy and also scale of alternative energy sources. As illustrated by this diagram, the scenarios, future scenarios. So you can see there are 4 scenarios for power generation in the future, and the green part in the bottom is the coal consumption for power generation, and in the top is the power generation from other energy sources. Yeah, and actually from top to bottom is that if we reduce the demand for electricity, that depends on energy saving. From the right to left is that we increase the scale of nuclear and other renewable power and also natural gas power. So you can see that in the worst case here, continuously increasing coal consumption before 2030. And in the best case, if we save energy very well and develop alternative power in a large scale, it is also possible to control our coal demand for power generation before around 2020. So actually, the future is very uncertain in China. I think that maybe the future is between the worst and the best. Okay, the next underlying mechanism for this issue is that the huge end-use energy demand in China is mainly because of infrastructure building and products exports. And as discussed in China, urbanization now will become more and more important than industrialization as the main energy demand driver. As shown by this diagram, this is the energy flow diagram for China in 2005. Though data is old, but the structure is still kept in recent years. You can see that in the end use, actually about 40% of energy in China is consumed for the production of structural material, including steel, cement, other metals and materials. And the reason is mainly because of the export of energy-intensive products and also large-scale infrastructure building. As we can decompose the energy consumption of the whole society in China, actually 1/3 of the energy consumed in China is used for products export, as energy is embedded in the products exported. And 1/3 is used for infrastructure building. The energy is embedded in fixed assets such as buildings and materials. And only 1/3 is used for domestic consumption, which I think is very large in developed country. So the strategic suggestions and the collaboration opportunities that I think China and the US can work together to promote the development of energy saving and the low carbon towns, regions, to shape low carbon economy and society. Though maybe it is far from the topic we are talking about, the coal, but I still think it's very important to control the demand for coal. And actually in China, though the development of low carbon towns, regions, still at early stage, but it is developed very rapidly. This diagram just shows you some towns already have some activities of the low carbon town, we call it LCT, in China. Actually, the real number should be much larger than that. And as concluded from the town practice in China, in the bottom right, actually the way to implement low carbon towns. What I think is essential is that for region, how to produce products and service to earn money more efficiently with less energy consumption is essential. The problem is economic structure in the future. And another issue is that living style and energy service level in the future, because China is growing, and where China will be in the future is still uncertain, and we can do something to control it. I don't think that China can live so comfortable like in US, because we are very, very limited resources and environment space. And also, in China, we also have some regions rich of coal resources and other resources. But as the energy demand is increasing very rapidly, these regions began a rapid development. But the problems, I think, is that for these regions in rich of coal, for example, in the area of East Ningxia, Ordos, and Yulin, Shanxi province, they all have a very ambitious plan about coal mining and coal power generation, and also coal chemicals. As planned, only 2 years after, this region, the production of raw coal will be more than 1 billion tons, actually. And I think close to half of the coal will be converted into power and chemicals in this region. And we know that in the West, we are lack of water resources. And also that maybe cause that a very bad competing between this region because they are all doing the similar thing. So next issue is how to avoid overcapacity problems. As driven by rapid growing market, overcapacity problems occurred in the whole coal value chains. Actually, in China, we can observe a rapid expansion of capacity of coal production, power generation, and coal chemicals, and not all the facility is used well. In the development, actually, we have constructed some very high cost capacity. And the underlying mechanism is that if the demand is released too rapidly and the production capacity will increase very rapidly, especially in China, maybe we will build some capacity with very high cost. And it will make an increase in average price of the products, and then maybe harmful for the future competitiveness of the economy, and then finally cause price fluctuation. And in the end, I think it's harmful for both supply and demand side. It's not only a problem for China, but globally, because everyone is observing the huge demand of China, and a lot of countries is constructing production capacities according to the market increase in China. Not only in coal, but also other steel and others. So the strategic solution here is that China and US should work together to properly expect the future demand of energy and coal and guide their demand. And we should dynamically balancing the supply capacity, including indigenous supply and global supply, to realize a minimum life cycle cost. These diagrams just show you the problem of overcapacity. If we build production capacity referring to the peak demand, so in most of the time, the production capacity will be wasted. If we only develop production capacity to meet a part of the demand and to meet the rest demand by import, energy will be saved. And also, I think it's good for economic growth. So this just an idea that actually we know that China has a very huge demand, and there's also demand in other countries, especially in emerging economy. And China could satisfy demand by indigenous supply. However, the resource in China is limited, and the cost is not the lowest. Some are very high. And globally, actually, in other countries, we have a lot of low-cost resources. So the problem is that I think for China, it's better to balancing the supply capacity from indigenous supply and also global supply to pursue a minimum cost. Because in the past, in making any strategy, China always think we should satisfy the energy demand by ourselves. But in the future, I think it's inevitable an increase of the import of energy for China, not only oil, but natural gas, also coal in the future. So the last issue is how to use coal more efficient and cleaner. I will not introduce this in details. Actually, in China, we have a lot of things to do. Actually, we have more work to do compared to US because we use coal in such a large scale. For example, the green mining, coal mining, and utilization of coal bed machine, promote coal treating according to coal types, promote polygen and also carbon capture and storage. Maybe CCUS, not only CCS. We must use CO2, actually not storage in underground. And also improving the efficiency in conventional coal-fired power. And I think that for Sino-US cooperation is a very important direction to cooperate on the retrofit and management of existing coal power plants. Okay, so I will stop here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Liu Wei, for your presentation. Now I'd like to invite Liu Qiang for comment. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. Actually, I think it's quite high pressure for me to give these comments because coal is always biggest problem in China. I'm from the National Climate Change Strategy Center, so I'm mainly working on low carbon strategy and low carbon planning now. So I'm thinking from my personal perspective, low carbon development is now quite a key issue in China, and we want to develop our low carbon strategy for next 10 years, next 20 years. So I do some homework to read their presentation today, and I'm thinking that how coal can play a role in the low carbon development in China in the future. Kevin and Dr. Ma, they gave a very comprehensive picture of the low carbon coal value chain and also gave a lot of recommendation. So from my thinking, I think it's for China we need coal. It's definitely we know about 70% of energy consumption is from coal, but I think we have to consider how to use coal efficiently. That is actually, I think, is most key issues for coal value chain, clean coal value chain. First one, actually, that if we want to clean coal value chain, is have to be that reduce the environmental negative effects of the coal use, including some like air pollutants, including the carbon emission. Now China is the largest emitter in the world, so I think that we need to consider this. But I want to emphasize that. Actually, from my understanding, the clean coal value chain means that we need to use coal more efficiently, much more efficiently than before. So, considering that, I think it's one key issue for Chinese governments and for Chinese industry to consider is to give more serious cap on coal consumption in the future. That's, I think, is quite important. So, I think if we can give some like cap on coal consumption in the future, then that means can give very good incentive or signal for industry to increase their efficiency to use coal. So how to control the consumption from my personal view? So I just share some common opinion from mine. I think it's first of all, the Chinese government should. We already emphasize that we will do very top level designing for every aspect of the energy consumption and also the carbon reduction field. So I think that we also need to consider how serious decision we want to make on the control of the coal consumption in the future. I think the earlier we can make this very real decision, hard decision, and strong decision, that the earlier the coal problem can be solved. So based on that, I think we should have very clear political signal. We also need to have very clear roadmap, and we also have good policy incentives. That is like top level designing, and also that's quite clear picture for China. So second one, I think that we need to also consider the cost of using coal. Actually, it's I think many people already hear the air pollutant problem in China recently, especially in very short periods. We have very serious air pollutant problem in some areas. So I think if we include this environmental cost into coal use, that coal might be not a cheaper choice for China. So I think that in the future, we already have some resource tax. We already have some environmental tax. Like Kevin mentioned, we are discussing the carbon tax. So I think in the future, if like this carbon pricing or some environmental costs can be introduced to the system, that coal maybe not a cheaper choice. We need to consider another alternatives. And third one, I think is for China, we also need to consider from the long-term perspective rather than from short-term perspective. We need to change. Now the central government's already in the 12 5-year plan and also the 18 Congress reports, we already emphasize that we will change our economy growth pattern. We will update our economy structure. So I think it's the most important thing that we need to consider, that the long-term cost via the short-term cost. If we can reduce the use of coal reduce the dependence of coal. Maybe from short time it's quite high cost, but from long-term perspective, I think it's more cost-effective compared with other choices. And especially, I think the most important thing, last night we also discussed these issues. I think it's quite important to avoid the high cost, which is in the future, in the long future, if we need to unlock the dependence of coal, that might be very, very high cost. So I think we need to consider now. And finally, I think it's okay, and we need to consider from different perspectives. But do we have the solution? Do we have the alternatives? I think it's we are now considering how to diversify Chinese energy supply. I think we have alternative, but the problem not so easy to solve. But at least I think we have some choice, like natural gas now. That's the quite ambitious target in China, and also that renewable energy increase very fast, and including some others. So I think that we need to have different find some different channel, different solutions to solve this. From my personal view, I think I'm not totally quite optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic on that. So I think additionally, based on this, considering, I'm thinking it's based on also the two speakers, their thinking. I think if we want to in the future cap the coal consumption, if we want to increase the efficiency of the coal use, what kind of policy and what kind of measure we need to do in the future. I just want to emphasize 2 points. One is the MRV system, which Kevin mentioned. I totally agree that MRV is now quite important, but I'm also review the national inventory and do the national inventory work, and also have to involve some MRV negotiation. But I know that we need time for China to increase our capacity to do this. But I think I want to emphasize, if we want to MRV system, the most important thing that we need to monitor the results. For example, for the coal use, we have data. We need to improve the data quality, but we have to consider to monitoring the performance of the coal use. For example, if the air quality is still so serious and so bad, we need to really consider. We need to monitor if there are some areas is still very serious problem. So we need to check back to the data resources, and we need to check everything. That is quite important. And also another example is building sector. Usually now the policy is based on, in China, based on if some actions is adopted or implemented in some area. But I think more important is we need to consider if there are some energy saving benefit we already got from this kind of measures. This is one point. The second point, I think it's quite point. It's good. We need to provide very good policy environment in China for market-driven actions. I just want to have two examples. One is that I think it's electricity pricing reform. We already considered this for several years. I think that is quite important for China, for renewable energy power use, for many things to use electricity more efficiently. So I think we need to really seriously consider this like electricity pricing mechanism. Another one is the standards. I heard that the United States already have very good standards, emission standards, energy saving standards for transportation sector. So I think in China, we also need to consider how to use standard quite effectively. For example, now we just, if we want to build new projects, usually we just, using political authority to approve that based on some standards. But I think we need to consider use some like emission standard and environmental standard in the future to control this new project development. So I think that is might be for some areas it's a big change, but we need to do now. So I just stop here, and I hear the Professor Yang's comments. Thank you.
Fuqiang, please.
Thank you, Kevin. My comment is trying to find what is the key issues between China and U.S., and we can work together in the existing cooperation and the potential cooperation in the future. And when we're talking about the coal value chain, and so we have to understand is what is the data. If we have no data correctly and accurate and reliable, So if you develop a policy and have a tax or other, mechanism, it doesn't work because, maybe your data is not reliable. So in 2000, and we find out that if we have a national data for coal, and we still have a local data for coal. So the difference between these two statistic data is about 100 million tons. But now people think it may be 300 million, 500 million, even people said 800 million tons of coal. Is a difference. So I think U.S. can introduce what is data and statistic, this kind of approach, and to avoid, these local or other enterprises, and they submit data, and we can find out what is the problem in their data. So I think it's quite important for China to develop a data collection and gathering system. And second is we have to scale up use of the renewables and natural gas. In China, Chinese leaders is very concerned about the energy security, particularly for oil, natural gas, and even coal now is about 6% of coal is imported. So for natural gas, we encourage this kind of policy adoption to use the Middle Asia, the pipeline from Russia. Now they have a new agreement to import natural gas, that's pipeline, and also LNG from Malaysia, from Australia, from Middle East. So we think the first important issue is not security now, is replace the coal with the natural gas. And U.S. have developed shale gas. Now Chinese trying to learn how can we develop a shale gas in China. We think that is find out is China have a good reserve or resources for shale gas, Thai gas, or all these non-conventional gases, but we also concerned about environment impact. And we think it's about water issues, methane, land, and chemical fracturing, or other community, they are concerned. All these we have to put in a priority, and rather than say we only develop a shale gas. So for renewable, and people think that is long-term strategy. I don't think so. In the world, if we think in the future they have a couple important issues will change the world patterns, and first is they have a couple options, and the U.S. of course shale gas probably, and for the EU and probably is carbon price, and for China maybe I will say renewables. Maybe that's a people surprise, because simply China can make renewable technology very, very much cheaper. It's very competitive. And third is I still like to promote a market reform in the coal sector. And Kevin have talk something, but I will say we like to further reform. And another is that we like to see the coal market is very competitive. So in this case, you can find out in China many local government they have a set barrier for this competition. They say, for instance, in Shanxi, that is a coal-based provinces, and they say if any coal shipped from our Shanxi, the price is not lower than some certain price, lower or price. So that is actually local government have a very strongly and heavily and regularly the price of the local coal. So we think that we have to move this barrier. Another question is, say, U.S., the coal is very competitive and they like to ship more coal to China. Why? Because China, the price in the coastal area is very high. But that is one side of a story. But another side, actually cost is actually is not competitive and make this cost lower down. But in the coastal area, if you find out wholesale and retail price, and they have some company is monopolize the local coal market. So I think that's important. And for the market reform, and I guess is a resources tax and carbon tax, and other is quite important. And so I think that is another third. Finally, I think of course they have many factors we can limit it coal demands. For instance, the carbon tax or have a cap. But in U.S. we learn is actually the driving force is public health. So I think is now in China the large scale and very dangerous smog happen in China. That is good because that educates policy makers and public. We have to put public health first. Thank you.
Thank you, Fu Xiang. Before I open the floor to the audience, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. The first one is about the air pollution and carbon emissions issue. The Chinese Environment Minister Zhou Senxian once said, "I'm responsible for carbon monoxide, but not carbon dioxide." In China, climate issue and air pollution had a clear cut between the National Development and Reform Commission and the Ministry of Environmental Protection. In the future, what could be done in order to better coordinate the environmental protection activities between these two agencies? Fu Xiang.
That's a hard question, but I will say because you try to ask me find out what difference or they fight between these two agencies. But I would like to say how can we find the area actually they get consensus. And one area you just mentioned about the carbon tax. And carbon tax is under jurisdiction of the Ministry of Finance. But Ministry of Finance are very proactive and to promote a carbon tax. And that is the area we call the environment tax is one of the environment tax. And of course, Ministry of Environment Protection welcome this idea. It definitely is their alliances and to promote this carbon tax. And second is for the NDRC, and also they have a concern about what is social and economical losses and due to the environment damage. So I think that is a area you can see how coal have a cost for the public health and the environment. And Greenpeace and the Energy Foundation, we carry out a study, and that is actually is 7.1% of the annual GDP is losses due to the coal uses.
Thank you, Fu Qiang. The reason why I ask this question is because I'm writing a report entitled "The Simultaneous Control of Coal-Fired Air Pollutant and Carbon Emissions in China," and I personally feel it may be relatively easy to sell this type of idea to one agency instead of another. And thank you very much for your suggestion. And another question is about the national energy consumption and national coal production and consumption caps, which is proposed by the National Energy Administration. I recall during the 11th five-year plan period, the central government set a national coal production target at 2.6 billion tons, but in the end, the real production figure is 3.2 billion tons. I wonder what's the rationale behind the government thinking they're so serious about this type of policy instrument. Liu Qiang, do you have any idea?
Yeah, actually, previously I also mentioned that this cap of the coal consumption is quite important. From energy perspective, I don't think that it's quite difficult for China. We're still increasing, we're still growing, but I think now it's a quite serious, most serious problem we need to consider from our perspective is to how to reduce the growth speed of the carbon emission. In that sense, the controlling of the coal consumption is quite key issues. Kevin mentioned a very good point that previously we do have some planning, we do have some prediction, but finally we surpassed that point. I think that is the real problem for China, that we have some planning, but sometimes we didn't follow that planning very well. And we even have some idea, but usually we just want to follow the traditional pathway. So I think we need to consider now, if we want to really cap the coal consumption in the future, I don't know when, but I hope it should be short time. We need to consider now seriously how to change our growth pattern. That is quite important. For example, iron and steel capacity now is quite there's overcapacity problem in China. So in the future, if we want to control the consumption, one option is we found many alternative options like renewable energy, nuclear, and also the natural gas. But I think it's another very important issue is to control the demand, which Dr. Ma also mentioned in his slides. The building sector, for example, in the future, in next 10 years, based on our prediction and also based on the announcements or some research by Minister of Construction, they mentioned maybe next 10 years, every year is about 1.4 to 1.5 billion square meters every year in China will be built. I think it may be too much for China, and we need to consider how to control what kind of lifestyle we need. I think we cannot copy the United States living style to live very far away and driving car. That is not appropriate for China. And also that like iron steel, what we really need in some industry sector. And I think many Chinese experts already agree that we will achieve the peak of iron steel in very, very soon time. So I think that kind of issue can help us to consider how to change basically our economy structure, our economy basis. We need to change to more dependence on the consumption, but we also need to change to considering some other problem is how to make this dependence on consumption in a very low carbon manner. Is my point. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with you.
I would like to say something about this issue, because several years ago, I'm tracking the problems in the energy strategic planning in China. I found the two important things missing. While we have mentioned everything, renewable energy emissions, the two things missed in previous strategic planning is two aspects. One is that we do not have a clear target of the consumption, the total primary energy consumption. And another thing is that we do not have a cap of coal consumption. I think that's the problem, at least from the strategic planning aspect for the energy problem in China. So I think it's very important to put these two things into the strategic planning for sustainable development of China. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Liu Qiang that if every Chinese aims to duplicate the lifestyle in the United States, the planet may be doomed. Yeah. So now I'd like to open the floor to the audience. First of all, please wait for the microphone, and then identify yourself and ask a question, a real question, please, of course. Yeah, Ken. Please wait a moment.
Thank you, Ken Lieberthal at the Brookings Institution. This has been a terrific set of presentations and comments. If you don't mind, I have two very concrete questions and one broader one. Concrete question one for Kevin, which is that I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to ask you. I've had it in mind for so long. But anyway, for Malimwe, I was very surprised when you told us that we have now seeing an enormous expansion of coal washing in China, given China's growing water shortage. And I don't quite understand where the water is coming from for this vast expansion of washing of coal. So I wonder whether you would comment on that. The broader question is you've laid out a lot of very good ideas about what China ought to do in terms of greater use of market forces, cap on coal consumption, target for primary energy consumption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The question is really, what changes would you need to make in how the political system operates to get those things actually done? Because it isn't like these are new ideas. They've been around for some time. The system has not proven capable of making those kinds of changes as versus investing more money in production capacity and renewables and so forth. But when it comes to the marketization side, the establishing caps, changing the economic structure, the really fundamental approach is arguably, while the desire has been there, the reality has generally been in the opposite direction over the last decade. So, how realistic is this? Or what else needs to change in order to make it realistic? Maybe the better way to put it. Thank you.
Thank you. New Way, please respond to the coal washing question first.
For conversion, I'm not so sure about water usage in conversion, but the two things I know is that first, actually the water recycling in the coal mines could supply some water resources, and I think the water recycling ratio could still be increased in the future. And that's good enough. That's one thing. Another thing that I know that the dry coal washing technology is in development, but I'm not so sure what's the stage it is. We can also use air to wash it. Thank you. Yeah.
Ken, just now you raised a very good question. I personally believe the Chinese government needs to change the mentality, need to respect the national circumstance in China before it regulate the energy sector. For example, I am not a big fan of the national cap on either energy consumption or coal production and consumption, because this type of regulation is not compatible with China's national circumstance. Well, the government should aim to improve the statistic connection system. And having said that, there is a market regulation that can help China to better regulate its energy sector. For example, carbon trade pilot may not be easily kicked off in China. However, if the Ministry of Finance can adopt a carbon tax in this country, the story will be totally different. And also, the common and differentiated responsibility may be applied in different parts of the country. A national cap on coal consumption is very difficult to be disaggregated at provincial level. If we go to those coast provinces, they are much better developed. They are more willing to pay for environmental protection. In this type of region, we may the Chinese government may consider to have regional cap on coal consumption. So that's my answer to your question. Liu Qiang and Fu Qiang, do you have any response?
Okay, just briefly, yes, I know usually when we talk about these issues, it's quite broad issues and quite basic issues. From my personal view, I think it's quite important especially for local governments. They have to change the idea about what kind of growth they need. We have to, like Kevin mentioned, we have to respect the Chinese situation, Chinese characteristic. Chinese circumstance. But we also need to consider is the GDP is the only thing we want in the future? Is the economic growth the only thing we want in the future? I think now it's time for the local government and also central government already. I think is have good discussion and very serious consideration on that. And also, I think it's very important for local authority to consider what kind of growth we need and how important we need to put like environmental impact and also the carbon emission issues in that. Another thing I think it's like I mentioned before, I think it's quite good for us. It's quite important for us to provide very good policy environment for market driving actions. However, I don't think that market can solve anything. Sometimes like standard, I think is also quite important. This is basic benchmarking, and then we can use more market driving policies. So I think regarding that market driving policies, I think it's also that for the local government, they need to consider what kind of scheme design they need, especially some innovative scheme. I think we can learn many from the European country, from the United States, from the many other developed countries, but we have to consider if this scheme, how to use this scheme very appropriately in China. That's also very important. I cannot say very detailed, but I think it's in my opinion. Thank you.
This gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Dan Morrow. I teach about climate change policy at George Washington University. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. As you well know, the future of the world in terms of climate change depends largely on what China decides to do about its coal resources. I wanted to ask about shale gas. Two of you mentioned it. And Mr. Fucheng mentioned that China is trying to learn to use its shale gas resources. And I think, Kevin, you said it was difficult. Could you talk a little bit about the effort to develop the shale gas resources as a substitute for coal, and whether or not there is any international technical assistance that might help China in learning to develop its shale gas?
Fucheng.
Theoretically, China is rich in the shale gas reserve and resources. And that is why Chinese government like to develop shale gas in China. Now, the question is we have to say what is deregulation or what is heavily regulation in which area. And deregulation is for price. And in China, natural gas price is quite low. So now they have a reform for the price. So first is we have to give an investor and company a very strong signal. If you involve in the shale gas development, conventional or non-conventional, you are profitable. You get money back. So that is quite important. And second is we have to understanding is because China, if develop a shale gas, the front cost and the first investment is very high because China is a mountain area, and if the shale is very deep, is up to 1,000 meters deep, and the water issues and other issues, and so that is if we can deregulate price and the Chinese developer and can cover all these costs. This cost is much higher than the American company did in the U.S. And to answer your question about the cooperation with international, and I think that's no problem because every international company find this is profitable, so they like to get in. And the question is how about the Chinese company? And now they go out to buy out some international company and try to get this kind of technology and can be used in the U.S., Canada, or even in China. And so I think is other heavy regulate is that we have to ask the Ministry of Environment Protection and to regulate, the environment issues. And so far, I simply tell you, in China, we don't have even standards for the methane emissions, for the water, cleanliness and wastewater and chemical stuff for fracking. And so I think is now we work very closely with the MEP, and first is develop these standards and regulations.
So the shale gas development is rather marginal in terms of its profit. So it's very difficult to imagine the giant energy companies such as Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC can be very interested in this type of development. They may be good at building a petroleum refining facility, may be good at developing the conventional oil assets, but in terms of shale gas development, that's another story. That's why shale gas boom in this country was kicked off by those small and medium-sized enterprise. I don't think the national circumstance in China will be different. Another issue is the environmental enforcement in China. That's a big concern here because I personally don't believe setting standards and regulation are a major bottleneck in terms of environmental protection in China. The enforcement is. If the shale gas well drilled across the country at scale, I don't know whether it's good or not. Scott.
Scott Smiles, U.S. Department of Energy, National Energy Technology Laboratory. I just want to add a little bit about the U.S.-China cooperation related to shale gas, or more broadly, unconventional gas. There's an ongoing dialogue for a number of years called the U.S.-China Oil and Gas Industry Forum, which is a public-private dialogue around all oil and gas issues. The shale gas has become a central piece of that discussion, so it will continue. To have that dialogue both around the opportunities for U.S. investment or U.S. companies to do business in China, along with all the associated regulatory issues. Also, I'll mention that I chair the APEC Expert Group on Clean Fossil Energy, and a U.S. company just completed a regional study for all developing Asia-Pacific countries on the unconventional gas potential. That study covers, with shale gas being the big opportunity, but also covers coal bed methane and tight gas formations. We are also planning now a workshop, an unconventional gas experts workshop. It's a rather small event, probably 50 to 75 people later this year, probably late summer, early fall. And I've been in dialogue with NEA about holding that event in Beijing, where the results of that report will be discussed on a regional basis, and then propose how within APEC we can assist within the dialogue, particularly around the environmental issues, regulatory issues on unconventional gas production.
Okay. Professor Zhang.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Kevin, and for the Carnegie convening these events, and also very enjoy the talk for these panels. I have two small questions. One is, Lin Wei, you talk about the overcapacity of co-production and power generation. I don't know what is the basis, on what basis you talk about this, because we all know that there is overcapacity, for example, like wind power, because the transmission line power grid does not catch up with development speed of the wind power capacity installations. But as far as I understand, I would say China still experience structural shortage of power capacities, power demand. That's my first question. Second question is, those days in China, very fancy talk about low carbon tongue, low carbon whatever. I don't know, you work on these issues. Do you have any specific recommendation what exactly means by low carbon tons? Or is there a Chinese government on the national level, there are some guideline and reach to certain levels, and by what indicator then this ton will be considered as low carbon tons? Thanks.
Okay, very good questions. And for the first question, for power generation, the overcapacity I mentioned is that we can observe a decreasing maybe increasing recently, but in recent years, it's decreasing loading factors of coal-fired power generation, referring to the data. One reason is that we built too many power plants. Another reason is that because we have a big scale of wind power and solar power, and we must have some power generation capacity to compensate for the peaking of the energy supply of wind, not stable, to compensate. And some coal power plants is doing that. That's a capacity problem. And also, we have observed actually in power industry in China, it's very interesting that even power companies, they know that it is not profitable for some projects or coal-fired power. They still decide to build it. That's related to the market mechanism and institution, because for power companies, the top priority for them is to stay in the market, and so the objective then is to be big first, so he can stay in the market in the future. I don't think it's very good, but that's the reality. For coal production capacity, I think actually we have so many coal mines now. I do not think all of them will be competitiveness in the future. Some actually maybe could not survive in the future once the coal demand or energy demand decrease. And also, you can see that globally, what I have, because I visit Australia and Canada. So Australia, for example, Australia actually they have very ambitious plan to increase the coal export to China, and also I know Canada is also interested to do that. Actually, you can observe that actually globally there's a lot of project planned for future coal exports and steel, and also steel is another story. So I think this is a challenge. So I don't know if I have give you a good answer. And for second question, the low carbon ton, it is a problem, the concept. And I would like to say that in China, a low carbon ton do not mean we can reduce the absolute CO2 emission in near term, because most of the time still developing. So in near term, the main target to reduce the carbon intensity, for example, carbon emission per GDP. But in long term, we must lock in a low carbon society economy. Though we can doing some expedient ways like improve efficiency, reduce energy waste, do not change the economic structure and consumption behavior. But it may reduce some energy in near term. But long term, if do not change the economic structure, still rely on heavy industry, still waste a lot in consumption, and it's not good for the future. We will lock in a high carbon. So a low carbon ton in China is that actually in near term you can reduce carbon intensity. But in long term, you can lock in a way of absolute, maybe cost many years, absolute low carbon emissions. That's what I try to say about that.
Now I'd like to connect last two questions. Mr. Shi.
Okay, I'm Jin Song from Embassy of China. My question is not to speakers, but to the professor from Georgetown University. Just now you mentioned about the cooperation about shale gas. I just want to ask your suggestion about from a United States side, how could we do in the future about the cooperation between our two countries about the shale gas? Thank you.
Then Jennifer.
Want to thank the panel. You guys kind of went that really good golden middle path, zhongyong zhe dao in your recommendations. Don't want to be too extreme, too little with coal control. Question is about who makes the decision for how much coal to import? Because one of you commented that China's importing 6%. Is that coming from the top? Is it coming from the provinces? Where's that decision made? Easy question.
Thank you for your question. I'm actually teaching at George Washington, not at Georgetown. And I'm not an expert in shale gas. I recognize that this is an important question. The only suggestions that I would make is that, as I understand it, the development of shale gas is not only a technical problem, it's a policy problem. And the design of a policy and regulatory framework that gives sufficient pricing incentives for the development of the resource is critically important. So I would hope that in terms of cooperation, the U.S. does have a very well-developed pricing and regulatory system for natural gas. And so there may be opportunities for collaboration about the development of that policy and regulatory framework. That would be my only suggestion.
In terms of coal imports in China, I don't believe there is any government agency currently can fully regulate this. But if we look at China's National Energy Development Plan, over time, the central government, especially National Energy Administration, its attitude towards coal imports have become increasingly flexible. In the future, I believe it's possible for the government to realize when the Chinese coal consumption is peaked, what's the structure of the coal value chain might be quite important. If when the coal consumption is peaked, hopefully in 10 years, China meet all its national coal consumption with domestic coal, then the country had overbuilt in terms of its coal mining capacity and coal transport capacity. So if a certain percentage of domestic coal consumption are met with coal imports, then when the Chinese national coal consumption is peaked, then the government is in a much better position to regulate the coal value chain. Do you have anything to add?
So I just want to come back to the low carbon tongue. It's Professor Zhang mentioned. Actually, we are now helping Chinese government to develop like some pilots, low carbon industrial zone, pilots, low carbon society, pilot low carbon city. From my point of view, I think low carbon tongue, we need to. This is quite different for different regions. It's for some regions, if we consider low carbon tongue, we have to consider this absolutely cap. We cannot depend on intensity. From national level, intensity target, but from the town level and especially some like very small scale level, we need to consider. So I think it's quite now it's very hot topic. That's what is low carbon in China. It's many different people have different definition. Actually, but I think in the town level, maybe the small city level, I think it's we need to consider benchmarking. I think for the low carbon town, it have to be at least advanced national level, with the same weather condition, with the same industry resources condition, and we can also consider international advanced level for some town. So that is, I think, is just want to add this.
So one more question, David.
Thank you, Kevin. I know you're over time and I'm pulling rank here, but I just wanted to ask a basic question I don't quite understand that I haven't heard yet, which is in the regulation and management of coal, I should think it at least be in part a function of how much of coal is coal development and production and is owned by the government versus the private sector. The more my intuitive thought is that, to the extent that the coal business is government owned, it's going to be harder to regulate it by another agency because you're regulating your own, the public sector. So what is the split between government-owned coal and private-owned industry, and does that, in your judgment, have any effect on the ability to manage coal in China?
1/3 of China's coal production are from the private mines. And I would like to extend this question to some of you who is willing to respond.
Always hard questions. Yeah. I think in China is we are not say one company is still 100% government owned. So far, I would like to use the publicly owned because they have a stock in the stock market, issue their stock. So, but if we use the government owned, I think it now is as I say, is a dominate. And for private on the coal mine, and generally speaking, is a small and medium one. Now consolidation is the small coal mine now reduce less and less because they damage the environment and very small and have a safety for the workers. All the issues they have to close down or at least buy out by big company. So, but I'm not worried. About this is a regulation because they are government baby, and it's hard to do it. But I will say probably not, because for this company and they have a dual obligation. One is they work as a private company, and the profit is still their target. They like to pursue it. And second, because they still is a public-owned company, they have to listen to the government regulation. So in China, the situation is not quite different in U.S. So now question for me, at this moment, I will say the question is not private or state or publicly owned. The question is in China, we have too many small coal mines that damage our environment, climate change or other. First, that get these small coal mine closed down or buy out and consolidate, come out to something like 100, couple hundred companies, and they still can compete each other. And so first is a close or buy out a small coal mine, and second is a competition between these publicly owned companies.
So the status quo in China is the state-owned coal company actually are better regulated. They are more environmentally responsible. Having said that, the reason is the government hasn't provided a transparent and fair playing field for the private coal enterprise in China. So in the future, how the government can consolidate the industry, but meanwhile create a better atmosphere for the private sector to compete with state-owned company might be very important for a Chinese central government. Now I'd like to conclude this panel by inviting each moderator and speaker to give one paragraph to the audience about this session. What will be the take-home message from you? We will start from Dr. Liu Qiang.
Just one word?
One sentence.
One sentence. I hope United States and China, we can cooperate in this field in the future, because I'm coming from the negotiation process. So I hope. It's my hope.
Yeah, I may answer your question because you're from the Climate Change Center. And I will say, in the long term, the driving force is the climate change and to reduce demand for coal.
Okay, due to discussion, I found there's still a lot of issues deserved scientific research. So I will continue to do that after return.
So the coal issue in China is complicated because the national circumstance in China is so different than the United States. But if U.S. and China can work together and some of the mistrust can be eliminated in the future, I believe the chance to better regulate the Chinese coal industry can be significantly improved. Thank you very much.